I didn't dare say too much against him, both from fear of pissing him off and because he stood our best chance of escape. Instead, the light seemed evenly distributed across the sky with no visible source. "How much food and water do we have left?" Frank asked. All of them were beyond a shadow of a doubt. Dead panic arose in my body, both from the presence of dead people and from the realization that I had been asleep on a moving train for more than 2 weeks. I collapsed to the ground in front of one of the dead passengers. She was an elderly woman, dressed elegantly with wide open and piercing blue eyes. "What the hell was that?" John asked. "We'll cut through the flesh with the knife and try to break the bone, but we need her quickly," I said as Frank started running to the back of the train. His leg had torn open completely, and black tendrils stretched out, wriggling around in the air as if searching for something. The obsidian black appendages looked exactly like the flesh of the sentinels, and it immediately dawned on both of us that the sentinel had deliberately let John live after spreading itself within him. No clue, a bunch of beeps. I looked around the room with my tired eyes, quickly realizing that Maya was missing. I nodded in return. Red forests reeking of rotten flesh, growing in density as we kept moving closer to a literal hell. We listened intently to the emptiness on the other side of the line, and a minute passed without anyone speaking. The sound shook us, and I grabbed my ear futilely trying to block it out, but it barely helped. "What the hell are you kids doing here?" the man said as both Maya and I passed out. And then as we touched the cold ground with our feet, a dim light appeared by the base of the cliffs shooting through the air. "What's that?" I asked. I turned towards her, but before I could respond, the ground below us started moving. All the while, they kept their eyes fixated on each of us, non-blinking, full of agony. "Push them out!" John yelled as he rushed at them with the stick, shoving the one furthest behind back through the door and then the next, but they kept getting back up. Frank collapsed to the ground, holding onto his guts, unable to scream from the intense pain. "Frank!" we yelled together as we rushed to his mangled body. Whatever it was, it didn't look anything like the yellow pus that I had expected from an infection. Still, he didn't respond. Every now and then, creatures would emerge from the densest parts of the structures, bizarre things vaguely resembling horses, with long bodies and impossibly thin legs stretching at least 15 feet away, and eyes that were pitch black, sunken things, far too large for their heads. About a dozen of them had gotten an inkling to our presence and galloped elegantly along our moving train, keeping up the pace. The vast emptiness was horrifying on its own. "Here, let me have a look," she said. I slowly peeked my head around the corner to see the compartment fully occupied by dark figures, all of them sitting perfectly still in their seats. "Hello," I said again. He leaned against the wall looking out through the window at the ever-growing crystals outside. Pearls of sweat formed on his forehead as he looked for different tools to smash his way through the wall, a noble but futile effort. "Hey John, you need to get some rest," I demanded carefully as I noticed him on the brink of collapse. "John, you were gone for 2 days," she finally said. A piece of glass cut my left eye, temporarily blinding me from pain. As he realized I was busy, message 3Y, just a kid and barely in my 20s, he moved the light away from me and reached out a hand to help me up. While I patiently waited for the text to go through, I kept staring into the dark. We were in the shadows, clueless and lost. I looked around at the worn-down buildings, desperately searching for any kind of life, but there was none to be found. It was enough to shut Frank up. Though an asshole, he knew his place in the group. "Infection?" I asked as I inspected the glass. Too wounded to move, he didn't even realize the severity of his injury. "Don't worry, I'm fine." No, they had already seen us. I helped him to his bleeding feet and together we rushed through into the next train car, where we pulled loose some chairs and used them as a poorly constructed blockade to slow down the creature. We continued through the car, repeatedly tripping over the dozens of corpses littering the floor. The guardian pointed his cane at them again, and while some fell silent, he wasn't strong enough to keep them all at bay. The chasm quickly widened, revealing a massive hole extending down into the dark abyss, with spikes and black tendrils extending from the burning walls beneath us. With my sprained ankle, I couldn't keep up with the others, and I slipped to the ground as it shook violently. She had been struggling with the same information as me, yet she kept helping us. "You do that, I'm gonna stay with John. Tell Maya that we need her quickly. It's a cave that serves as a doorway between our worlds. It's massive and dark." We climbed off the tracks and onto the platform. It was situated on a bridge, giving us a clear view of our surroundings. The text on the ticket was a language that I didn't recognize, just jumbled symbols and a date. And then some of my memories returned. The once green fields of killer crystals had long since vanished, and the forest of red pillars had grown so dense that it finally blacked out each ray of light brave enough to attempt to illuminate our path. If I had known better, I would have thought that we were back in the void, but it felt different, far hotter than it had before, even more devoid of hope. "I didn't want us to give up," she said. I kept my mouth shut. "Maya, get out of here," I yelled as spikes formed around us, reaching out to destroy our vulnerable bodies. And then out of nowhere, a dark rumble sounded alongside a bright light, and the ground came to a standstill. "I don't know, but right now we have to." She was cut off by John, starting to shake violently, screaming in agony without fully regaining consciousness. "Oh, it's a recent injury, caused by these sentinels, as you messaged them." Before I got a chance to question the environment, the darkness gave way to a large open space devoid of any life. Huh. None of us remember what happened. "We have to disconnect them," Frank suggested. "Why won't they let me die? I just want to die. There has to be a way inside." "Why is that funny?" "Well, if you haven't noticed already, 2 of us died. How is it possible if we're already dead? Where's John and Philip then?" I mean, he had a point. John broke off from the argument and everyone fell silent as we watched the creature fly beside the train. He said as he shoved his way past me, off to search for more tools. "If you hadn't have left your bag behind, I wouldn't even have had to go out and risk my life." "John," he corrected me, "we're in another dimension or some shit." His eyes had turned white from cataract, rendering him completely blind, and chunks of flesh were missing from his chest and abdomen, visibly infected and smelling like rot. She reached out and checked his pulse, quickly retracting her hand. "He's dead." "What do you mean dead?" "He's clearly living, talking and everything," Frank said. "Look at him, nobody could have survived those wounds, and he doesn't have a pulse," Maya said. Of course, despite the inflamed and painful cut in his leg, he refused any rest. I noticed a chunk of wood missing from it, as if somebody had kicked it in, leaving it unable to properly close. As I slowly backed away from the compartment, I glimpsed out through the windows into the empty void beyond. The creature had almost fully formed by the time that we got through the next car. Unable to grab us, it quickly realized that we were out of reach, and in response, it split open its body down the middle, revealing rows of black teeth and multiple tendrils that resembled tongues. It let out a horrific high-pitched shriek that shook the entire train, almost destroying my eardrums. The sound itself awakened the dead people strewn across the hallway. They lifted their heads and looked around until they fixated their eyes on us, which alerted the creature to our presence. He had turned oddly quiet, and we had to search every car to finally find him collapsed on the ground with the bandages ripped off and black liquid oozing out from the wound. Before we could even message Maya in to help, the train jolted into movement, quickly coming to a stop as the back cars had fused together with the crystals. One of my shoes slid off in the process, allowing me to get away. "Who are you?" I asked. "Well, that's a tough one," he said as he scratched his head. Without questioning him, I drank the liquid out of some strange compulsion. It tasted like piss, but it immediately revitalized me, as if I had returned back home and recovered from the ordeals in hell. They looked at each other for a moment, still visibly confused, and then back at me. I took a step inside. I walked through about 15 such cars, each alternating by rows of seats and compartments. What the hell is? 42 hours passed as counted by the beeps. Frank pulled John's knife out from the backpack and looked at us for the go-ahead. Unlike the previous one, it wasn't divided into compartments, but rather filled with rows of seats split in the middle by a central passage. But like the compartments, each seat was occupied by a dead passenger, each blinking in response as I quickly passed in panic. She fought back, but even without the tendrils, John was far stronger than all of us. It was a city, or at least it used to be one, now nothing more than the ruins of a previously inhabited place. "I'm not going with you," she said quietly. He sighed in response and we kept walking. "Can't we push our way through?" "They don't seem to be moving," I asked. Still feeling weak, I fell onto the floor of the hallway as John desperately tried to get free from the rapidly enveloping tendrils around his leg. As the grip tightened, his service weapon, still in its holster, fell to the ground, out of reach from him. Our conventional idea of hell required us to be dead already, though it never stated whether you could die twice or what happens upon second death. In the meanwhile, I kept staring out the window. "I'm okay." The first 24 hours each marked by an innocuous beep from Maya's digital watch. I couldn't get my mind off that name. With the absolute minimal amount of firearms knowledge that I possessed, I picked up the weapon and started firing at the center of the creature, franti-message 3 while pulling the trigger, and I didn't stop until the excessively loud shots were replaced by silent clicks. Though the rounds had barely phased the creature, it loosened its grip on John just enough for him to crawl away from a certain death. "Get me the med kit, will you?" she said as she pointed to Frank. While she did her best to fix up John's leg, I got a better look at the door. He had bought us a few minutes, but time was quickly running out. I humored the thought that we might be driving through a tunnel, but if so, how long could it possibly be? I stepped into the next train car. "I just can't do it." Its arms spread out, flattening out and covering the window. I took a peek back at the barricade to see the creature slowly seeping through like a black fog, before reforming itself on the other side. "Just sit down, let me have a look anyway." "They're behind the door," Frank said. He said as he pointed to the lifeless people sitting idly by in their seats. "What's your name?" he asked. Before I could consider the bizarre situation any further, the woman suddenly blinked. "Do as I say and run." Before we could even start to plan out the amputation, John shot to his legs, partially waking up from the pain, realizing what was going on. Get away from me," he groaned as one of the tendrils shot out at us, ripping flesh away as it extended from his wound. I pulled Maya with me out from the compartment and we fled forward into the next car, just as Frank came running back with an axe that he had found. "Where's John?" he asked. I wondered how far the darkness reached, if it had an end, or if anything lived in the void. "What happened to your leg?" I finally worked up the courage to ask. After Maya vanished, I felt at peace. "We ain't risking it. You're lucky that John found you." With an incredible amount of effort, I finally managed to get my legs working enough to stand up. Though I had used the wall as support, it was enough to move around, and I soon stumbled into the hallway of my train car. I took a moment to look through the windows in the hallway, and the world outside was empty. It both looked and felt as if nothing existed outside of the boundaries of the train. The darkness made it hard to navigate without falling to the ground. With my injured leg, I knew that I stood no chance of escape, but Maya didn't have to die with me. It was incredibly loud, vibrating enough to loosen the already fragile barricade in front of the door and windows. On the other side, the surveyors were trying to break through, and with a final push, the door gave in. It sounded familiar. "No, we still have 18 hours to go," I corrected him. I tried to confess again, but the woman noticed John's bleeding leg and rushed over to him. As we observed our surroundings, a bright light lit up the gray sky, almost blinding us with its presence. "We have enough provisions for at least 2 weeks," John said. Though the crystals had slowed down once we had retreated, they kept reaching out for the train, and they had already covered 2 of the cars in the back, slowly inching their way ahead during the day that we had been stuck. They seemed to react to touch, spreading faster with any interaction between us and the environment outside the train. "Are you all right?" I asked as I helped her to her feet. We left the house and carefully ventured into the dark streets, but the sky is so riddled with thick clouds that even if the sun existed, it couldn't possibly brighten up the ruins of Gahanna. When I tried to message 3 out for them, I realized that my voice had almost completely vanished, replaced by just a whisper. "Most of them, anyways." "Run for the cave," the man demanded as he collapsed to the ground, rapidly falling apart. "That's nothing." The sentinel got a hold of my leg. They were crystals, green, razor-sharp crystals that from just a few feet away resembled blades of grass. He fell to his knee as he lifted the cane, unable to support himself without its help. They had reinforced it with pieces of metal around the edges, also covering the window, preventing the creature from seeping in through the cracks, and its surveyors from seeing through it. Before one final spike emerged and penetrated straight through Frank's abdomen. "Sentinels? The thing that chased us," John explained. "No need for ranks or titles. I tried to help the ones that were already trapped, but they were far too gone. The Sentinels will take over Gahanna, rule it as they used to millennia ago, and the gates will open allowing any unfortunate soul to fall through the gaps of reality." John, as fit as he was, had turned into a spitting image of death himself, both from exhaustion and the infection spreading through his wounded leg. Ahead of us, miles and miles in the distance lay massive cliffs stretching straight up into the sky obscured at the top by the storm clouds. "What the hell was that?" John asked. We all kept staring at the shadowy things in the void, and though Philip was right, they couldn't possibly see us without their aids. "There's no time to stop." Without checking them for life, I jumped out from the compartment and shot the door. It was hell, and we were heading straight for it. "Gahanna, what does it mean?" Maya asked. Frank kept repeating in panic, getting quieter with each iteration. "I'm sorry, I should have told you earlier." Maya was far too good of a person, unwilling to consider her own well-being over that of others, and I knew that in my heart that nothing I could say would change her mind. She walked up to hug me a final goodbye before we parted ways for the rest of eternity. I held her tight as I whispered into her ear, "I'm sorry about." Without letting her finish the sentence, I grabbed onto her, swung her around and shoved her into the portal. The second she realized what was happening, it was already too late and her body washed away in the darkness, giving me a final look of sadness before she vanished. Gahanna needed a guardian and Maya wouldn't have let me stay behind, so without any other choice, knowing that she had a much brighter future back on Earth than myself, I made that decision for her. "Maya, I have to tell you something," I said carefully. Some parts were blacker than their surroundings, and then I noticed that they weren't just patches that contrasted with the rest of the environment but moving things, almost vantablack like a shadow moving through the night. It glided in the air alongside the train, quietly looming by with its eyeless body. It was a sentinel. "Guys," I said quietly. "Not like us." "That doesn't matter." "Wait, don't." I tried to yell, but it was too late and Philip stepped down hard onto the field. "Oh God!" yelled as the crystals cut through his shoes into the sole of his foot. The rest of us froze in our step as we saw Philip pull back in agony, clutching his leg. "It's not grass," I trailed off. "God, it hurts." Philip groaned. Maya instinctively ran to his aid and pulled off his shoe. "Everyone except for you, Thomas," he said. "What does it even mean?" I asked. They were quick to block the windows, and within a minute we had all settled down on the floor where we tried to discuss our next move as quietly as possible. "We'll be safe here for a bit." Though the growth was slow at first, it quickly sped up, covering his entire foot within a minute before proceeding up his leg. "Get them off me!" he yelled in pain as Maya reached out to try to rip them off, but John stopped her before she could touch them. Something just felt off by their presence, I said as Frank started running to the back of the train. But with every watch having slowed down, there was no way of telling how far away we really were. I don't know, I stuttered. You guys better look away, Frank said. He bent down behind the suffering man and whispered that he was sorry, before quickly slitting his throat. To all of our surprises, not a drop of blood poured out from the newly formed wound. I tried to look for a light switch or at the very least another person to help me out, but none were in sight. Frank stuttered as he realized what he had done. And with that, as if a veil had been lifted from our blind eyes, we finally saw the empty city for what it truly was. John kept fighting, turning his head to one of the exits, reaching out for it with all of his remaining willpower. I couldn't take my eyes off the elderly lady. I limped behind the other two on my twisted ankle until we eventually reached a large open square surrounded with what looked like temples. Unlike the surrounding city, they were beautifully built in stark contrast to their surroundings. Philip opened and rummaged through a large travel bag. I said as kindly as I could. Maya stared out through the train window, her eyes fixated on the crystallized remains of Philip. I was jolted back to consciousness by a violent coughing fit caused by the unnaturally dry air around me. They kept on arguing. Drops of sweat had piled up and started trickling down my forehead. Though I hadn't the faintest idea what my destination should have been, my memory simply cut short after stepping inside my empty compartment that had been November 12th. They might not know for sure that we're in here, John said. As we got to the space between cars, John unwillingly grabbed onto Maya with his arms. A tendril had wrapped around my shoe and John quickly grabbed my arms as I was pulled away. Guys, there's a sentinel outside, I said much louder. John had died to protect us from himself, and with that, an immense feeling of loneliness overwhelmed me. Our best chance of survival was gone and our next stop will be hell itself. His leg had completely shattered and split open, but the infection had spread even further, reaching his abdomen covered in tiny holes occupied by more dark appendages. Appendages. The air felt heavy and was filled with the stench of dead surveyors, but it was still preferable to the threat of sentinels, and in addition it was now an easy task to search for both supplies and any equipment that we could use to aid us in our escape attempts. Another day passed and the fields of crystals and Maya still hadn't spoken a word, apart from checking on John's bandaged wound and instructing him to keep taking the antibiotics. She just stood back and stared at the swirling darkness hanging in front of us. I'm Philip and that's Maya. In shock, John stumbled back and dropped his knife. Maya once again tried to run over and help him, but we all held her back. And then we noticed another and a third and a fourth, and before long we could make out hundreds, if not thousands of sentinels following the train. Don't worry, they shouldn't be able to see or hear us without their surveyors, Philip said. Yeah, what about it? We need to get out of here, John said as he pulled my arm and dragged me in through the door to another compartment car, though far nicer than the one that I had awoken in. All the doors had opened and the people were slowly piling out from each compartment into the hallway staring at us with their wide open eyes. We dove into the first available compartment. And the officer pushed one of the people out from it and locked the door. He sighed. Maya yelled in panic. The city wouldn't let him, and rather than freeing him, we had just put him into a whole other level of misery, taking away his voice and the ability to beg for death. It felt like hours had passed as I made my way towards the locomotive, and just as I was about to enter through a door marked first class, I was shoved to the floor by someone holding a bright light to my face. Suddenly, the train broke loose and we started moving away from the green fields of infectious crystals. Tall structures extended from some of the cracks, looking like red tree stems covered in veins and arteries, the cracks, looking like red tree stems covered in veins and arteries, pulsating and twitching in response to our passing. At the top, they broke into bubbles filled with swishing black goo, similar to what it oozed from John's wound. You'll need stitches. I came back as quickly as I could. Your way out. Drink it, he said as he looked at me. The train had broken down, and with no way of it getting back up and running, all we could do was wait as the green field of crystal spread onto the train and then to us. "It's just a matter of time. Stay down," he whispered. Maya said as she peeked outside the window. He said, matter-of-factly. One of the men said in a condescending tone, "I don't know, Frank, do you think that I did it on purpose?" I thought back to the old lady that I had seen in the first compartment, and I realized that John hadn't been discovered at all. I was the one that got caught. The red forest outside kept getting denser, forcing the creatures to break off, and as the trees grew taller, the sky darkened. I yelled in response. "Get your stuff." "Gahanna, did we make it?" Frank asked. "Maya, where is she?" I forced out, barely a whisper. He said as he pointed to the woman fixing up John. Frank closed the door that John had fallen out through, and we all stared at each other in silence. He guided our way through the twisting and turning streets, eventually giving way to a vast barren field riddled with the mutilated bodies of the lost souls. Without hesitating, the man started walking into the piles of dead, faster than the both of us despite his mangled leg. In the corner, I saw a few bags full of waste and empty food wrappings. As my eyes started to adapt to the overwhelming darkness, I could start to make out the vague shape of my room. "Thomas!" Maya yelled as she rushed to my aid, Frank continuing to flee towards the alleys. I shot to my feet in horror as she blinked again. Amputation was no longer a viable option, so we kept backing away as John screamed in agony, visibly trying to fight against the sentinels' movement inside him. While trapped in the morbidly beautiful landscape, John had taken it upon himself to find a way into the locomotive. No clue, a bunch of beeps. I didn't want to stay in the compartment with them, but I was paralyzed by the lack of a plan. "You must have a lot of questions, and though we're short on time, I'll answer as much as I can," he said. Instead, the man just fell to the ground and gargled incomprehensibly. The city had finally noticed our unwelcome presence, and it reacted violently by pulling itself apart, creating a gaping chasm in the middle of the square that swallowed anyone unlucky enough to be in the way. "What's happening?" Frank asked in a panic. "My job now will be to close every gap between this world and Earth, meaning that after this message, nobody will ever hear from me again. Tell my family I never suffered, and Maya, if you ever read this, I'm sorry." A part of me felt dead as I pondered these questions, as if the train was nothing more than a mere figment of my decaying mind, but the pain was ever too real. The tiredness felt too overwhelming for the world to be fake. Got a few survivors camped up in the dining car. I just came out to look for batteries, hoping that we could get a phone working and get help. She didn't respond. I slowly opened my eyes, momentarily forgetting that I had literally spent the past couple of weeks in hell. Alas, the time had come, and if we stood even the faintest chance of surviving, we had to be able to rely on each other. "All right, let's head for the locomotive and try to shut the train down," John said. Frank and I eventually decided that we would force him to take a break, even if it meant fizzy message 3Y restraining him. After a short talk with Maya to make sure that she agreed, we set out to force John into temporary retirement. Without hesitation, he attempted to dial a number. "Put it on speaker if you're trying to message someone," John said, still waiting for Maya to finish bandaging his leg. As the horrific realization hit us, the ground below us started to move. "Stay the hell down," a deep voice shouted at me. It had been 17 days since I had boarded the train. John interjected. The only one moving was Maya, and she only did so to check on John's leg. Of course she was right, the man should have been dead, yet there he sat, crying in agony and begging for a death that never came. I just stood there trying to get a grasp on the situation, barely responding to the others' questions. They must have seen me coming, I don't know how. "Hurry up!" John yelled at me. For the first time in weeks, we stepped down onto solid ground, with a brilliant green field only a few feet away from us. and noticing a glass filled with a murky brown liquid on the bedside table. "Not like you two. So that's it? We just sit here in the dark for another 4 days?" Frank asked. A small argument ensued, and while they discussed what we would do with the train station, I took a moment to look out the window. It jolted all of us to our feet in panic as we tried to decipher what it meant. "Tom," Maya said as she looked at me with pleading eyes. One of the tendrils had grown out from the wound, forming an amorphous black blob on the floor, still attached to John, feeding off his body. All we could do was stare at Philip as the crystals dug their way into his body, his bones audibly cracking and his skin rupturing as they continued spreading. As the mix of sentinels and surveyors came at us, the alarm kept blaring and I prepared for my quickly approaching demise. "Leaving Vacus, stand by." The tracks screeched as the wheels locked themselves in place and we quickly came to a sudden stop. What the hell just happened? We've stopped, but there's no platform or anything outside. Hopefully they're just scouting. The others were too busy discussing to notice me wasting power, but I just needed to write down some of my thoughts over text, ready to send if we happened to get a signal. I sent it to my dad hoping that he would share the story should I not make it back. I tried to lift my arms to block out at least some of the light, but I couldn't lift them. Something within the light had paralyzed me, surging through my body with intense pain. He grabbed me and pushed me through the gap between the wall and the creature, getting caught up in its tendrils as he did. They latched onto him and buried into his leg. He shook his head. And then the speaker gave out a new message in the form of Morse code. "Destination, Gahanna, 18 hours, do not get off the train," the code said as quickly as it had come. The light faded. It took a while before our eyes had adjusted, but once they did we were greeted by a brand new world outside the windows. The once empty void had been replaced by endless fields of bright green grass, only contrasted by tall blue mountains in the horizon. Miles and miles away the sentinels themselves had all but vanished, while the surveyors had turned back into lifeless corpses, now doing nothing more than littering the hallways. Where are we?" Maya asked. In the dark it just looked like weird scribbles on a piece of paper. "Shouldn't we just do the exact opposite of what they tell us?" "No, whatever happens, we're getting the hell off this train when it stops." "Regardless of what you might think, Gahanna means hell," Maya said. The argument went on fruitlessly for a while, Frank never giving in and admitting that we weren't going to reach salvation once the train had stopped. I didn't. "Do you remember where the train is going?" I asked. "You have to take care of yourself." "Do they know that we're here?" Maya asked. In the middle of the square sat an emaciated figure, a man with white, thin hair and protruding prominent ribs from his starved body. Rather than the desolate ruins that we had met as we entered, we saw a fully populated city, filled to the brim with suffering inhabitants, each mutilated in various degrees. Whatever it was, it didn't look anything like the yellow pus that I had expected from an infection. They kept looking at him in shock, not satisfied by his answer, and so he continued. Before the man could answer, a loud brief scream could be heard from one of the other rooms, one sealed by a heavy metal door, similar to the one on the locomotive. She handed them over to John, giving him instructions on when and how many to take. I was supposed to stay behind. They were too weak, as if they hadn't been used for days. Both John and I lay wheezing on the floor from exhaustion as I tried to look around, observing my new surroundings. The car was full of booths with a small bar all the way up front, covered in canned foods and bottled water. And lastly, that's Frank. We're clearly not dead, but that doesn't mean we're not going to a horrific place. "Keep it down, would ya?" he said quietly, clearly agitated by my idiocy. "What's happening?" I whispered. He just lay there screaming in agony until the crystals got to his lungs, and before long his entire body had been turned to a rock. Before we could process or mourn our loss, the crystals started spreading along the ground, slowly making their way towards us. "How did they see you anyway?" "They're not exactly observant unless somebody disturbs them." As I winced in agony, my mind suddenly felt clearer than it ever had, and then I remembered. I pushed myself up into a sitting position, noticing a glass filled with a murky, brown liquid on the bedside table. Even the ground within the cave was riddled with the bodies of the dead, and with each second that we spent there, they started to awaken. Firstly, there wasn't any smell, meaning that they hadn't started to decompose. And secondly, all of them had their eyes open wider than I thought possible. My eyes had started to fully adjust to my dark surroundings, and I quickly realized that not only were the people sitting perfectly still, but they weren't even breathing. "Run!" he yelled in agony as he tried to fight off the tendrils wrapping around him. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. I made my way from compartment to compartment, and while they all seemed to be occupied and none would open, and not a single person responded to my increasingly frantic knocks. As I reached the last compartment of the car, the train turned ever so slightly on its tracks, enough to knock me to the ground. I pushed my ear against it in an attempt at listening to the other side, but as soon as I touched it the hole returned, and the old man walked through it, shortly followed by a drowsy Maya. "Tom!" she exclaimed in joy as she embraced me in a tight hug. While we lay there, Frank and Philip rushed to cover up the windows with whatever debris and furniture that they could get loose from the floor. I checked the watch only to notice the seconds tick slower than normal. According to the time, we were only an hour away from Gahanna. Why not? Why? Why? Maya bent down in front of him and tried to get his attention. We were almost at the dining car when I fell back to the ground. We didn't need to answer the question because John quickly followed us, walking with his mangled, sentinel-infested leg. We messaged them. "You want to tell us how the hell you survived 19 days all on your own without food or water?" I couldn't answer his question. To me, only a few hours had passed, and though I felt thirsty from fleeing, I wasn't even close to being parched. "It's December 1st, she said quietly. Even with the emergency lights dimly illuminating our car, it was hard to make out our surroundings, and with no idea how to turn them off, we could only pray that the surveyors didn't notice them either. A few hours passed with none of us daring to speak up, all fearing that the sentinels would come bursting in through the windows at any moment. The rest of us rushed in to aid John in his futile attempt, but before we could even reach him, every single window on the train shattered from the force of hundreds of sentinels throwing their mangled bodies at the car. Covered in shards of broken glass, I fell to the ground alongside Frank, who tried to use me for balance. We had to make a run for it. They had known each other most of their lives, and now he had become nothing more than a memory, forever preserved within the green rocks. "I just woke up an hour ago," I said. As we got back aboard, we did our best to seal the doors and windows, but even then we had no proof that it would stop the spread. It continued for almost a full minute, none of us daring to speak up while we listened. Once it was finished, the message 3 ended on its own, and Frank looked around at us wearing a confused expression. "What do you mean?" "Gahanna, I know the name." "Thanks," he would have wanted us to keep fighting. The old man that had saved us stood by the window, staring out at the empty street, mumbling in a language that I couldn't understand. "Good morning," he said without even turning, somehow noticing my awakening. "It's what comes next that terrifies me." "What is it?" "Hell, I don't even know what it really looks like. It's the closest translation that I could come up with. Everyone touched by the void slowly starts to drain, their souls wearing out as they merge with this place." No response, either because the compartment was empty or because my voice hadn't been used for so long that it barely functioned. I grabbed Maya and pulled her with me, and we spurted for the cave only a few hundred feet away. Suffering, blind and deaf, without anything to connect him to the world that he lived in. "What do we do?" I asked. I think maybe we should finish him off," Frank said meekly. "We can't, he's..." Maya stopped mid-sentence, realizing that for once Frank was right. "I'm sorry, I think I've got to agree with Frank on this. He wants to die. The least that we can do is free him." Philip took charge, carrying what little medical supplies we had left while John followed. There was a decently brisk wind that felt great in an otherwise hot climate, but the grass didn't seem to sway even the slightest. "Officer, Wait, no, you'll get them on you too," John yelled. Unless someone takes your place," I asked. He nodded. I carefully peeked out through the window to see that all the people had collapsed back to the ground, and that the door leading to the car behind us had opened up. A tall obsidian black creature pulled its way inside using large tendril-like appendages. "Please, use the axe." Frank got ready to hit John, but one of the tendrils swung at it, snatching it away. He quickly bled out, too fast to accept his ultimate demise, and all we could do was sit over him as he let out his final breath and finally fell silent. "How the hell did you survive here all on your own?" "I don't know. The train, it's working again," Frank yelled excitedly before realizing that we weren't actually moving. I looked down to see that the barren fields had given way to an infinite pile of corpses, all rapidly waking up by our presence. Some just starting to scream while others were aware enough to grab for us. He didn't seem to notice us as we quickly approached him to see if he needed help, but even as we spoke to him he just sat there, rocking back and forth as he mumbled over and over again in a sickly voice. "I just want to die," I said as I walked closer to the portal. She didn't follow. "Who are you?" he asked firmly. "I've tried to close it, but I'm too weak." It was definitely something that I had heard before, if only to be stuffed away in the back of my mind, polluted by pointless information that I had gathered throughout my life. John sat down and the woman rolled up his trouser leg to reveal deep gashes in his calf. The horrible thought of them being dead struck me like a hammer, but I had to make sure. I bent down on my knees next to the closest man and I shook him gently. "Just sit down, let me have a look anyway." They stared us down, shrieking unintelligible words of agony. The guardian tapped the ground with his cane and the crystal facing down, and then Dad fell silent once more. Speechless, I could do nothing but comply with the man in front of me. "Wait, you're not dead?" the man asked. With a trembling hand, I checked the rest of the people for signs of life. Frank joined us with as many supplies as he could carry from the back cars, trying not to leave food or medication behind. "Oh, I can't believe we're moving again," Frank said gleefully as he returned to us, showing little concern for John's current state. Near the front of the train there was a sleeping car which we cleaned out and put John to rest in. Moving the mountain of a man was a tough challenge on its own, but it was nothing next to the challenge of keeping him alive through sepsis as the infection spread into his bloodstream. Too wounded to move, he didn't even realize the severity of his injury. Maya took on the task of watching John, making sure that he drank and fed him his antibiotics while the train moved closer to Gahanna. It would only be a matter of hours until we made it to our final destination, and I had yet to tell the others what that place truly was. I tried to say before John interrupted me. We turned towards the light that filled the cave. We looked at each other in sudden realization and shouted simultaneously, "The cars!" 60 hours passed and the void lingered outside of our train, ever present and full of unseen horrors. Despite the stress, I had somehow managed to drift off to sleep. Though restless, it was a deep sleep occupied by an incredibly vivid dream of a Gahanna. I saw it as an empty ruin of a city trapped in the center of a steep valley. Maya and Frank stood by my side with defeated expressions on their faces. "What will happen without you?" Maya asked. "As long as there's solid ground to walk on, we're not staying a minute longer than we have to," John interjected. "What?" It was Morse code. I learned it as a kid to secretly communicate in class. I know it's dumb, I was a geek, but I'm absolutely sure that's what the message said. None of this makes any damn sense. "Thomas," I responded. Its arms spread out, flattening out and covering the window. It started to form small cracks in the glass pane, allowing small tendrils to seep through. "God damn it," John whispered as sweat poured down his face. Suddenly he stood up. and kicked the door, breaking it straight off its hinges. It barely fazed the creature, but it allowed us for enough wiggle room to bolt past it. He grabbed me and pushed me through the gap between the wall. The creature, but it allowed us for enough wiggle room to bolt past it. How are we going to? I tried to ask with a trembling voice. No, leave me, he groaned. We looked at him in despair as the light started to fade and the dead started to awaken once more. His last sentences shut everyone up, and John stared confused at them. For millennia, I've kept this place safe, but even I have aged, and eventually I will perish like all things should, and the people that are already here, like the one that we Maya trailed off. They came during the time between the last guardian and myself, when there was nothing here to keep the gates between our worlds closed. Those who meet an untimely death or narrowly avoid, unable to process or accept it, they all come here. Maya burst out, annoyed by my hesitation. My memory served a little help in recognizing my whereabouts. But upon fumbling around with my weak hands, I noticed that I was sitting in a fabric-coated chair in a room that seemed to vibrate ever so slightly. Though it was vaguely humanoid in nature, it didn't have a head or any eyes. I just nodded in response. Maya and I looked at each other, both wondering where to start. How did we get here then? Maya asked. I guess they know that my time is up. As I got the piece of glass out, I saw the sentinels digging their way through the broken windows, turning to a vicious fog and pouring in through each crack in our barricade, reforming themselves on the other side just like before. It was hopeless, and all we could do was stand there in frozen panic, unable to think of any plausible escape. While Frank was busy trying to contact the outside world, using one of the few battery packs still working, I approached Maya to tell her the pitiful truth about our journey. I'm what you could message 3 a guardian, and my job is to keep this place locked down, preventing any unfortunate souls from accidentally slipping through dimensions and ending up for the rest of eternity here. The crystal was spreading with tiny shards breaking off, embedding themselves into Philip's skin and tearing through it as they grew. The 29th of November. John giving them instructions on when and how many to take. John said, still out of breath. I can't stop it. I groaned in pain as I landed, severely twisting my ankle while the others landed slightly more elegantly. John lifted a finger to his lip and signaled for me to be absolutely silent. I noticed then that he had a gun holster attached to his belt. Now it will at least serve some purpose. I tried to lift my arms to block out at least some of the light, but I couldn't lift them. Most of them were blind, with their eyes either ripped out or turned to coal. Those unfortunate enough to see had their limbs removed, or their organs torn out onto the street, unable to do anything to end their miserable existence. Leg. Don't pay him any attention, he's a pain in the ass 90% of the time. When we get there? I nodded. Gahanna. There I sat, surrounded by 6 dead people, trying to contemplate my next stop. I guess so, it doesn't exactly look inviting, but there's nothing else around. The train was still moving, which clearly meant that somebody had to be in control of it. Before my time, I don't know who or what I was. I believe I used to be a human, but it has been so long that any memory before this place has long since been wiped out. Don't worry about it, Thomas, Maya said as she noticed the absolutely baffled expression on my face. Frank, get the knife and something hard. The movement of thousands if not millions of lost souls moved the ground enough to cause cracks that shot towards the cave, ripping rocks from the wall. The cave started collapsing and we dove through just in time to avoid being smashed to pieces by the falling rocks, one hitting Maya on her shoulder and tearing through her flesh. Yeah, it's the same with all of our tickets as well. You're bleeding, she said. They were getting closer. John grabbed and pulled me down to the floor, away from the window. Forget that, Frank interjected. Don't worry about her, Thomas. She's resting in the chamber as the infection fades. It had been a day since the train broke down, but despite the time that had passed, there wasn't any noticeable change in daylight. The sky hung above us, blue and bright, though no sun existed to let us know whether we were still on Earth. I looked over at Maya, who had finally realized the same as myself. I tried my best to comfort Maya, though nothing that I could say would ease the loss and trauma that we had all just experienced. Our best bet would be to simply keep everybody alive through the next part of our horrific nightmare. Did you get the batteries at least? Of course I did, you idiot. They're in the bag, John said. She just kept staring at the creatures that were following us. I know we're all on edge, but I think it's time we discuss what we'll do once the train stops again, Frank said. First the windows turned to sand and then the seats rotted away as if hit with 1,000 years of time, and finally the floor started to crack, causing us to plumb, and then the seats rotted away as if hit with 1,000 years of time. And finally the floor started to crack, causing us to plummet into the ground. That's John trod off as speechless by the realization. Can't we push our way through? They don't seem to be moving, I asked. I hope you live a great life. That's all we have? Maya asked. John responded. This place needs a guardian. It persisted for minutes, completely blinding out any memory of the empty void that we had left behind. It wouldn't make sense for me to confess that I already knew as well. Back on the train, John screamed. No, you still have a chance at escape, but we have to move quickly. As minute a detail as it seemed, it warranted a closer look. All the while, these thoughts ran through my head. Gahanna, well, I trailed off. What the hell is that sound? John yelled as he clutched his ears. It was rhythmic, Morse code just like before, though in the mess of static and distortion I could barely make out the individual beeps. I'll be alright. People were getting restless, unable to stand up and move around without alerting the surveyors. We still hadn't made a decision whether to stay on the train as we had reached Gahanna, or to bail and try out our own luck elsewhere. We have to hurry, Maya. I took a hopeful look out the window and stared at the lush fields just out of reach. There was no way that we could reach the cave with the lost souls awakening, and the guardian knew it without a word. He slammed the cane to the ground, falling down with it. An impossibly strong light penetrated the air, instantly silencing the dead as he saved our lives. His skin started to crack and burn, with the vast amounts of energy surging through him. I checked my pockets to look for clues. I found my phone, which had long since ran out of power, and my wallet, though it contained a ticket. We fell silent for a few seconds while Frank processed what we had just told him, and then he suddenly had burst out laughing. Really? Hell, that's the best you could do, he said. I started saying before the cop put his hand over my mouth, gesturing for me to keep quiet. He sighed again. The people out there seem fairly docile. The street was mostly empty, just a few suffering and lost souls wandering, curious to our sudden presence. Though they started to follow us, they kept a safe distance. Don't be ridiculous, I was gone for a couple of hours at the most. She pulled out a digital watch and showed John the time and date. That one of us had to stay behind and become the next guardian. What's happening? Philip stuttered. Dozens of them flooded in through the broken barricade, stumbling over each other in the process. What? You heard him, Tom. What was that? Without an answer, he limped over and touched the door with his cane. It morphed into an opening which he walked through, and then it promptly closed itself off. Tall cliffs stood around the city, too steep to be climbed, too massive to allow for such light. So what now? We get off the train and wander the wasteland? Or sit here with the last of our supplies waiting for hunger to kill us? Frank asked. There were 3 seats facing each other with windows on the right-hand side, though they revealed nothing more than an empty void on the other side. On the other side was a door with a small window which led out into a hallway, and then it dawned on me where I had woken up. It was a train compartment, and the train was still moving, though seemingly rid of any other people. I tried to get up, but my legs refused to properly cooperate. No, I'm fine. He shouted back as he popped a couple of pills, a mixture between antibiotics and painkillers. I pointed to it without saying a word, but he just shook his head in response. It means hell, she continued. Enough for maybe a day, Maya responded. He shook his head. The people out there seem fairly docile. It was a valley, gray and dull, with little to no light penetrating a layer of thick clouds above. And then the train started to slow down. What about your gun? If we just kill the surveyors, they won't be able to alert the sentinels. I don't have any ammo. One moment of betrayal to give her a chance at a good life, even if it meant myself staying behind for the rest of time, it would be worth it. What do you mean you don't know? How can you not know? Frank said, getting agitated. Before we could even indulge the idea of climbing on the outside of a moving train, we were all shoved to the ground as the train rapidly lost speed. You go first. It was dark, not a single ray of light to even make out my closest surroundings. They never got too close, proudly curious as to what and who we were. We're not going to make it, are we? She said without a hint of emotion in her voice. Without any other options, we headed down to the streets and started searching for a way out. I got to my feet while the train still turned and noticed the door to the last compartment slowly glide open from the turn. Hello, can anybody hear me? I messaged 3Ed out with a trembling voice as I approached the open door. Doesn't matter. The ground started moving again, not to attack us, but to swallow Frank, to fuse his limp body with the concrete beneath him. His eyes narrowed in suspicion at my obviously guilty tone. Tell me what? Our destination. Before any of us could respond, the phone started emitting repetitive beeping sounds. Destination, Gahanna, 108 hours, do not get off the train, I said. It moved quickly, all the while its tendrils stretched impossibly far towards us in a hungry attempt at catching us. So you mean to tell me that we're already dead and that our next stop will be the realm of Satan himself? Yeah, I guess. We're getting off this nightmare. Whatever, Frank interrupted. A bright light penetrated the otherwise gloomy car as Frank booted up his phone using one of the battery packs. Maya tried her best to stop the bleeding by applying pressure, but it hardly slowed down the incessant flow of crimson blood. I'm okay. I rushed to help him, but he was surrounded by an invisible barrier, making it impossible for us to reach him. 108 hours, just over 4 days before we reach our next station. It had thin stumps that resembled legs and multiple more tendrils that slithered along the walls, seeming to sense its surroundings. The name's John Hendricks, he said, and we better get out of here before these things wake up again. They're not dead, I asked. Yeah, well, not exactly, it's like they're in hibernation. I looked at him in confusion. People in hibernation? They ain't people, kid, not anymore. As he spoke those words he seemed surprised by something behind me. Shit, I was too slow, he said, oddly calm. While I lay there, I tried to message 3 out for help with my barely audible voice, but nobody could hear me. I don't know, but let's get out of here. There was one undeniable fact about them that just didn't make sense. Maya and Philip had sought cover in one of the corners where they sat embracing each other, while John charged at the sentinels wielding nothing more than a kitchen knife. I took out the ticket from my pocket and tried to read it. Officer Hendricks took his flashlight and set it to its lowest setting to help me read. He lay there in shock, his eyes darting frantic message 3 wide back and forth between us. There were green crystals embedded deep in his soul, covered in jagged edges, making it almost impossible to pull out without causing more damage. We've got to get you back on The entire car was dimly lit up by a couple of rows of emergency lights on the ceiling, and it was clear that they had survived there for a couple of weeks already, though if the 4 of them were all that remained, I didn't know. What the hell happened to you, John? A man in his 50s asked. Gahanna is hell, Frank. Thanks for watching. The 3 of us sat down around a table made from concrete and bone. We both screamed in shock, unable to decide whether to leave John behind or flee, or to stay and try to save him. Frank came rushing in just in time to see one of the tendrils shoot out from the leg and try to grab me, but I ducked beneath it just in time. Dead. It doesn't matter. We're all going to hell. I took my dead phone and grabbed one of the battery packs and plugged it in. We ran through the door and shut it behind us while one of the men pulled a large metal rod through a makeshift lock. As we passed the dead, some of them awoke, albeit too weak to rise. He turned and limped towards me, revealing a mangled leg kept up by his cane made from bone and a bright green crystal, exactly like the ones from the fields that we had passed. It's my fault. I peeked in through the window into the next compartment and I could see the vague shape of people sitting still in their seats, but upon trying to enter I realized that the door was locked. I tried to knock but the people on the other side didn't even flinch. And besides, that idea is stupid. It just uses those things to look around for survivors. Once we had reached the locomotive, we were faced with a heavy iron wall blocking our entrance, a door with no handle nor a keyhole to open it. A few minutes passed and I got back on my feet, stumbling over to the door unable to open it. Don't worry, I'm fine. Suddenly, an impossibly bright light filled the entire void, instantly turning the sentinels to mere filaments of darkness lingering in the air. I'm Thomas, I stuttered. The door opened and John let himself fall off the train into the thick mass of red trees and darkness. I held on to Maya as she collapsed to the floor from exhaustion, carefully checking if she had been wounded from John's grip. Maya froze mid-sentence. Gahanna. What are you waiting for? Get out of here. He yelled. We returned to the dining car and picked up our bags, alongside any amount of food and supplies that we could carry. We hadn't yet reached Gahanna, but considering the implications that we were heading straight for hell, this would be a safer bet. We quickly made our way through the train, littered with the fresh corpses of people that had died weeks ago. Their connections to these sentinels had been broken, leaving them limp on the ground with no direction. On the other side of the door leading to the next car we could hear the shuffling of surveyors trying to get in. They knew that we were here, which meant that the sentinels would be alerted very soon. Maya and Frank helped me to my feet as we witnessed the last chunks of the train vanish before our eyes. Why are they telling us to stay on this train? We fell silent again as Frank attempted to dial another number, but to no avail. Frank attempted to dial another number, but to no avail. For a few moments, he just held the phone in shock before he regained his senses and he answered, "Hello?" No response. "Hello, can anyone hear us?" Frank asked again. They're usually confined to their void, kept at bay by my mere presence in this world. But recently they've been getting braver. I turned around to see the people moving their heads around, all of them staring directly at us, their eyes now fixed and unblinking. "I'm sorry about Philip," I said after a minute of silence. 19 lines for 19 days passed on a train that never stops. The oldest man, Frank, came over to me, looking as suspicious as ever. Something within me knew that she had made it home, and with that I gained a whole new awareness of the place that I would message 3 home. The papers given to me by the old man, once filled with an incomprehensible language, suddenly turned into instructions for me to follow, and that's when I knew that the place had chosen me long before I had even entered Gahanna. The houses were mostly empty, too broken to set foot in without risking total collapse, filled only with crumpled papers written in a language that none of us could understand. Where they had furniture was crudely constructed from debris of metal, and what could only be bone fragments, but whoever built any of it were nowhere to be seen. No one responded on the other end, but no sooner had Frank lowered the phone to put in another number, it started ringing, a blocked message 3 ID. Maya came running to my aid, quickly checking his pulse and breathing. "Oh, he's burning up," Maya said. He paused and looked at the untouched glass on the bedside table. "Do we have any antibiotics in the bag?" she asked. "I'm not afraid of the things out there. They won't bother us until we get closer to the light," the man said. Refusing his orders, I dove to the floor and grabbed his gun. Give him a break, Frank. Can they hear us? I don't know, but stay quiet anyway. She pulled me up just in time to avoid being swallowed by the ground. With a throat like sandpaper, I couldn't even respond. We can do that, we just gotta stay here. I sat down and shook John in an attempt at waking him, and while he didn't respond, at least he was breathing. I glanced at the black liquid trickling down his leg, forming a puddle on the floor and not daring to touch it. As he tried to finish the sentence, a large thud could be heard on the other side of the door. We're coming to a stop, Maya said as she peeked out through the window. At first, it looked like a seizure, but once we saw his leg, we realized it wasn't anything that could possibly be explained by modern medicine. The creature moved closer and before long it was standing just outside the door. Just a rocky, flat surface surrounded by infinitely tall cliffs on each side. I then checked for a pulse and though I'm not a doctor I couldn't find any signs of life. As the shock from the bright light faded, I saw that the man was dressed in a police uniform, well-built and bald. I know, John, but we can work without you for a couple of hours. We've got to hold up in here until they go back to sleep. The man looked at the floor with a shameful expression on his face. It was a frame of glowing fog surrounding a pitch-black portal, hanging a few feet above the ground. That's it? I asked. An old man emerged from up the alley wearing a worn-out but perfectly tailored suit, and a cane in his left hand. The train had turned quiet, illuminated by a bright light from the sunless sky above. The other younger guy came up to me and reached out his hand. Don't pay them any attention. Before long, the train stood still and all the doors opened. Automatic message 3Y, signaling for us to get off. There was a sign on the empty platform next to us, written in a language that I couldn't comprehend. I pulled out my crumpled up ticket and compared the text, noticing that some of it matched Gahanna. I mumbled. Don't die on me, he said before pulling the handle. A conductor released somebody with an idea as to what the hell was going on. And so I decided that my best bet would be to make my way to the locomotive, and pray that not everybody had died on the train. I was traveling. We all just woke up at different times on the train and had the idea to make our way here. It's safe, mostly, and the sentinels keep us from going out very often. It was just a piece of fragmented information long since forgotten that I had learned during my childhood during some religious class. Gahanna. Within seconds he had vanished, and he became one with the city of Gahanna. Before we could get the chance to catch our breath, the wall started moving once again. Am I bad? I just heard someone moving around and thought that you were one of them. The other passengers, what happened to them? I asked. If we don't do anything, we'll be dead in a matter of days. Both Maya and I knew our true destination, but hadn't yet told Frank. If we both leave, millions will suffer. There's no one there, Maya said. I kept staring at the slowly ticking clock based solely on my biological assessment of time. It felt like days had passed, but according to the clock itself it had been no more than a measly half hour. It was the same with each clock on the train. They simply didn't work together, with reality measuring each minute as a small eternity. With John dead we felt more vulnerable than ever, and since his death, we hadn't spoken a word. He pulled out his knife and got ready to peel the shards off Philip, but the crystal simply cut through the knife like butter, spreading onto that as well. Just leave me alone. I need to think. I heard a small beep that shot me to my feet, and I looked down to see the man wearing a digital watch that alerted him that an hour had passed. I looked at the watch and noticed the date was also written in the center. In the dark, he couldn't see much, and after a minute, he decided to empty the bag of all the random items that they had gathered on the train, finally pulling out a box of pills. Amoxicillin? He half asked, half said. Philip nodded and tossed Maya the box. We need to survive for 4 more days until we reach Gahanna. John responded. He stood up and peeked out the window into the hallway, before pulling down quickly back behind cover. What the? We have to cut off his leg. I didn't even use the flashlight until I saw Thomas here, and by then they had already awoken. So you waited until they went back to sleep? The woman asked. So what do we do? I asked. The track ends here. Yeah, the wound isn't too deep, I'll be fine. With that, the man shot out from his car and started gathering a bunch of papers, filled to the brim with drawings and hardly intelligible text in a strange language. Take these, he said as he put the bag of papers in my hand. I sat down and glimpsed out the window, watching the landscape change as we quickly passed by. The infinite green fields that had taken Philip started to give way to solid rock, gray and continuous, with scanty cracks breaking its perfect surface. I know it. I checked her pulse, still nothing, yet her eyes kept blinking without any other signs of life. In shock, I looked around to find that the other 5 dead passengers were also blinking rapidly. With the mortal wound, the wall fell silent. Ah great, what now? Frank asked. Maybe we can climb out one of the windows and get there from the outside, John suggested. After a couple of minutes, despite the mess of sounds, it became apparent that the sound was just a loop of beeps with a simple message played on repeat, leaving Vacus, stand by. Are we really going to listen to some cryptic message? Philip asked. Like I don't want to be all pessimistic, but why should we trust them? They're telling us to stay on the train, but do they mean as it stops or now while it's heading there? Maya asked. I remembered getting on the train. On the wall beside the door, somebody had etched lines, marking each day gone by. We headed after Frank, who had started running down one of the alleys seemingly devoid of any people. As he entered the alley, the concrete walls started moving vigorously. Frank, wait. I yelled, but he didn't hear me. By the time he noticed the walls, it was already too late and hundreds of spikes shot out from them, morphing out from the concrete buildings. Frank dodged the first one as he tried to retreat back towards us, and for a moment it seemed that he was in the clear. The ground looked so soft, and I contemplated for a moment whether it would be smarter to just jump off the train. That idea was quickly put to rest as I got a look around the train, now filled with blissful daylight that had immediately changed the mood. We never got the chance to make a decision before the train simply started disintegrating under our feet. The entrance had been sealed by a heavy metal wall, and it seemed that even from the outside, there wasn't any windows nor a feasible way of entering. It was simply a block of iron that had effortlessly dragged us through 2 dimensions, broken down only to cause us pain. A whole minute passed and then another, yet the man refused to die. Frank, we need to tell you something, I said. I screamed, and the door to the dining car shut open. 2 men and a woman ran over and helped John pull me free from the tendril's grip. I awoke abruptly due to a high-pitched, glaring sound emitting from a speaker system hidden in the ceiling.